Prior to introducing our distinguished panel, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the voices speaking out against violence and the horrific murder of George Floyd and many other tragedies that have reshaped our nation. It is pertinent to emphasize that equality and justice is a human right that must be implemented with dignity, fairness, and in an equitable manner for all citizens and for all human beings. Across our nation, the world, thousands have protested George Floyd's death in police custody on May 25th, demanding social change and reform. We must all be a voice and come together to stand against racial inequality, social injustice, and violence of any kind. In these times, the words of Martin Luther King truly ring true. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. On that note, domestic violence and sexual abuse does not discriminate among cultures, races, or socioeconomic boundaries, while practicing social distancing and safety precautions. Today's town hall meeting is in partnership with Access, WDHT-Tv, and Wayne County Dispute Resolution Center. Our well-known and distinguished panelists have all been on the front lines combating domestic violence, sexual and emotional abuse. COVID-19 has redefined when and how these issues are addressed via law enforcement, the courts, advocacy work, and within the halls of Congress. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists and thank you all for being here and taking the time to discuss this extremely essential matter with our viewers. And also we're broadcasting live on Facebook, so welcome to our audience on Facebook as well. With us today is Dearborn's Police Chief, our own Chief Ron Haddad. Thank you for being with us, Chief. We have Access's Community Health and Research Center Director, Mona Mackey. Welcome, Mona. Presiding Judge of the Third Circuit Family Court, Judge Kathleen McCarthy, and of course, our own Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. Adding to our public health crisis and to the toll of the new coronavirus, mounting data suggests that domestic abuse is also an infectious disease. So flourishing in the conditions created by the pandemic and unfortunately increasing daily. So I'd like to start off by giving you each an opportunity to further introduce yourselves as well as talk about the work that you have done regarding domestic violence pre-COVID-19. And we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll get into how things have changed within the area that we are dealing with right now. Mona Mackey, would you like to get us started?
Yes, thank you, Sihan. At Access, particularly my role is to oversee the Community Health and Research Center, pretty much responsible for all of the health initiatives in the community, health promotion and disease prevention. And among the 70 programs that I oversee, our Victims of Crime program, which serves victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, hate crimes, discrimination, child abuse, and neglect. And a program that is very near and dear to my heart, as I am a survivor myself. And with the support of Access leadership, I was able, with the help of my team, to create a comprehensive wraparound model to service this population. We are very, very centered in servicing this population. And, throughout the years, we learned more about the community, the struggles that we faced as a community dealing with domestic violence, and really looking at the programming that we felt was going to really help support survivors in rebuilding their lives. And some of those things that we have been able to do is provide the counseling, of course, and the advocacy, the peer support groups. But beyond that, we now have a transitional housing project. We've been able to have attorneys on board who are able to help our clients understand their legal rights and more so to navigate the legal center and courts and the financial support as well. So it's a program that we bring a lot of awareness to, and really want individuals out there to know about the program, to come in and get the services that they need. And I will just say this, what makes this program unique is that, again, it's client-based, meaning client-centered. We meet people where they are at. They decide what services they need, and we just help support them.
And I know that most of the funds that are raised go directly to the clients through that
So
program.
yes,
which is amazing.
every single year we host an annual domestic violence fundraising dinner, and really that dinner has been the sole, I mean, it's one of the most important initiatives in terms of raising funds, because those funds help us support people with housing, with food, transportation, medical needs. I mean, just about anything that they need to help rebuild their lives. So those funds become very, very critical when you're helping individuals who are in unhealthy and abusive relationships.
And the housing that's coming up too. That's exciting for DV victims.
Absolutely.
Judge McCarthy, in the courts, pre-COVID was challenging, and I know that your voice is very strong in regards to domestic violence, domestic abuse nationally, and I know that you've spoke at a lot of events that I have attended and worked with as well. And your story is extremely poignant and remarkable, and you have overcome. So you are a survivor as well. But the court system, how is DV individuals being addressed, and are their rights being put to the forefront when they're known to be a DV victim?
So, well, thank you, Siham. But so, my background is I grew up in a house that was, my father was very violent, and I say to people that really one of my earliest memories of as a child is my dad chasing my mom around the table with a butcher knife. So, still gets me emotional.
I know.
So.
But you are strong, you're a survivor, and you're here, and you are helping women in that position.
Those kind of situations in anybody's life shapes who they become. It's never anything that you leave behind. It helps mold you. It helps shape you. Hopefully, you persevere beyond those situations. And so for me, going into family law was one of the natural ways for me to protect children, if you will. I've been a judge for 20 years in the family court, and with this COVID situation, the pressure for me was we had to shut our courthouse down, and I couldn't shut the courthouse down without having a way for people to file personal protection orders. So that was one of the biggest issues for me in order to figure out how we can move forward. We did not in Wayne County have e-filing or electronic filing system for personal protection orders or family law cases. And so, while most people were sitting at home enjoying this extra government supplements, I was creating a e-filing court, and it's really, we got it up and running. We were able to shut our courthouse down. Of course, we needed to for the safety of our judges and employees, and also for the public to stop bringing them into the courthouse.
Well, I know you spearheaded the entire transition from that to the computers, and if your tech abilities are like mine, I know how challenging that was. But you did it.
It was a lot of hours, and you know what? And I'm grateful that we did it. It's we're over that all those hours of that intense work, and we have it online. And frankly, it's up to the same level of filings that we had before we shut the courthouse down. So people are having access to the system. I think it has a lot of benefits. We don't have victims coming into the courthouse, and of course their abuser is waiting for them in the hallway or waiting for them in the court. They don't have that anxiety coming down to court, knowing that their abuser is going to be there in the court. It's much safer for the judges and the staff because we don't have as many, people aren't bringing their family members down to court, which is always a situation in the personal protection order courtroom. So this, having this electronic virtual way is certainly the way of the future, and certainly something the state of Michigan is working on. And so we have a rough system up in place, and I'm continuing to work now with the state to get a more refined system in place.
And that makes so much sense to be able to do a PPO through those means rather
Sure.
than physically going down. So I think COVID sort of pushed us into that direction a little
Quickly.
faster
Very
than,
quickly,
than,
yeah.
than originally expected. Chief Haddad, you are always on the front lines,
Yep.
and you are the one going and answering those calls. And I know that you have another initiative too, focusing on DV. So tell us a little bit about
I'd like
that
to
work.
thank Judge McCarthy, first of all, for getting those PPOs online, because there's just three things we can offer people, whether it's criminal, whether it's counseling, or whether it's a PPO. And without that, some people, that's the only thing they'll
Right.
do because they don't want to prosecute, and we know why that is.
Sure.
But let me say this. I've been asked lately, how is crime overall because of COVID? To put it in perspective, Dearborn crime is down 33%, but domestic violence is only down 12%. So domestic violence is still taking a higher tick than all the other crimes. So, and that's not surprising.
But in general, it is down 12%?
It's down 12%, but
where it's
all other
higher in the entire world, up 30, 20
right, it's
in
down
Australia.
12%. And
It's
there could be a
wonderful.
lot of reasons for that. There can be some non-reporting going on because if you're home the whole time, you may not get access to file a complaint. But I can't stress enough that the silent victims are the kids and other family
Yes.
members, and we try to get every domestic violence case reviewed by our First Step or Access. We have partnerships. So even if they choose not to prosecute, we try to get them some assistance and some counseling. We had pushed before COVID and before we went into this budget talks, a city ordinance that would allow the police officer to take cases that are, 3 and 4 deep, where they never prosecute, where the victim is battered up, where there's kids involved, where someone has broken into a house, and prosecute for the victim. Because we know oftentimes they're reluctant for a number of reasons: economics, fear, father to the kids. Usually the father, could be the mother. So we pushed for that, and the item got tabled without discussion to be put on a study session, but we just haven't had the time lately. So my hope is that we can get back to normal and get that city ordinance pushed through, which will allow the officer who does a complete investigation from the street to the detectives. They got everything on video, they process the scene, they get statements from everyone. Then the detective would interview the actor, which is the defendant, and then the victim refuses to prosecute, and it might be the third time that that's
Right.
occurred. And particularly with those cases where our fire rescue is involved by taking the injured person to the hospital, that's totally unacceptable. Oftentimes we take 3 or 4 weapons from a house, and there's a failure to prosecute. So with those type of cases, my aim would be to have the police officer with all the evidence present the case, which the state law does allow, by the way, and try to get them to more counseling and more accountability to make sure that it doesn't escalate. So that's kind of one of the things we had been working on right before COVID, and then we went into budget talks, and that's a pretty consuming time. So I would hope that now that we've gotten past that, we can get that back in front of the city council and get that measure passed, because it will protect our families.
Absolutely, and I think everybody here would support that and do what they can to make that go forward. Thank you, Chief. Congresswoman, I know that this is a hot topic for you, and you've been on the forefront with your pulse right on it. There was a scare in terms of VOW, violence against women's act, being defunded as well within the government. So, what is your role? What are you looking at, and what are you seeing in regards to moving forward and making this something that's on the forefront of all legislators and policy builders?
Well, first of all, like everyone here, this is an issue that matters a great deal to me. And like Judge McCarthy, I lived in a home with a father that shouldn't have had it and access to a gun. And those days, I'm not old, but I'm seasoned, and those days were a long time ago when you called for help and the police didn't even necessarily come because they didn't believe that it could happen in certain households. And I think one of the reasons we're all talking about it today is that we need to remove the stigma from those that are living in a situation where there is violence. And I think many women become emotionally and financially dependent. They don't leave because they're worried about their children. They don't understand they're afraid of what will happen to their children, and they don't understand what happens to the children by staying in those circumstances. And I listen to all of this conversation, but I'm very worried about what is happening right now when people are living in contained situations where they are not able to go out, they're trapped. They don't, even when you talk about computer systems and filing electronically, some people don't have access to computers. The abuser keeps them from having access. They're afraid to make a phone call. If they try to make a phone call, they're not able to make the phone call. And while many people are being the tension, the emotion is being increased because of being in a trapped, contained situation, those that are being abused have less ability now than they did to be able to reach out for help. So that is something that concerns me very deeply. We passed the Violence Against Women's Act 14 months ago in the House of Representatives. And there are many First Step and Access and other groups that I work with. I'm active with most of the organizations in the state are not getting very critical federal funding that's needed for these programs because this VAWA has not been reauthorized. In the CARES Act, we authorized $45 million for some of these, but it's not enough for anything, and we have funded the hotline. But there are a lot of people who don't know where to go. They are threatened with violence if they try to reach out for help in every way. So I wish I could trust that domestic violence is really down by 12%, but I think there's a lot of people not reporting. They don't know where to turn. They can't turn. And all of us work so hard on this issue because people don't want to admit that it could happen to them or that it's happening in their family or it's happening in their household. And it happens in all kinds of families. It happens in every community. We can't tolerate it. We've got to reach out a hand to help families that are going through this. And for law enforcement, it's the most dangerous call that they respond to.
Absolutely. And you said something that was very, very, very distinct in regards to the children. Moms and whoever's being violated usually don't take that step because they want to stay for the kids. But the realization is having those kids in that environment and seeing that creates that kind of behavior. Chief, I want to come back to you for just a second. The Congresswoman was talking about the runs that you make, and I'm very interested in finding out the kinds of runs that you've had dealing with DV. Do you take the perpetrator in? What has been your experience given COVID? Given the whole environment. Have you made any kind of?
I can tell you that in spite of COVID, with domestic violators, when that threshold is crossed, we make an arrest, and we try to secure a warrant. And in cases where they don't prosecute, they're held for up to 20 hours plus. We process them as normal, and there's no shortcuts. So it's a full service, and that's why I was exceptionally happy when you mentioned about the PPOs. That just gives us one more option to offer the victims, and so I'm glad about that. But yeah, there was no shortcuts. We didn't close down, and we continue to go out on every call for domestic violence or assault, and the scenes are processed, and where appropriate, there's an arrest made.
There has been a lot of programs to help victims of domestic violence, but when I think about that, you try to be as proactive as you can in any kind of situation. Mona, I know Access provides for the victims of domestic violence, but what kind of proactive programs are there for individuals who are children who have experienced domestic violence within the homes, or even for men, the perpetrators? How do we get them reformed and back into society? Giving them tools to understand or how to manage their anger. I mean, do we have those kinds of tools? And I'd like to ask everybody.
So there's
but
a
Mona.
lot of work being done in the schools. There's a lot of parenting that we provide. There's a lot of resources for children. For example, we have our Child and Adolescent Health Center. It's part of our medical center, but we have social workers on site there to kind of help alleviate some of the stigma with youth and adolescents getting help. So there are programming out there. In terms of the perpetrators, there are state certified programs that they are referred to ensure that they're getting the help that they need. So I know that once they get to court, that's part of the order, is that they get treatment. The problem, Siham, is, again, Congresswoman Dingo brought up the issue with stigma, shame. It's not happening in these families. They don't want to talk about it. Seeking help is looking at parents look at that as a failure if they're, dealing with their children. So, I'm happy to say that there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of amazing organizations out there doing great work. There's a lot of advocates out there. But the problem is, getting people to seek the services, and, we got to look at willingness and readiness, and, there's so many factors that go into, people making that decision that they're gonna get help. The resources are there. It's the shame and stigma that continues to be a problem, particularly in our community.
And I think the people that are interested in that are the ones that really you don't worry about. I remember we did an event called Call to Men.
Yes.
Around about DV, and we had about 50, 60 individuals there, but those were the men that were interested in this. But we have to reach out to those that are perpetrators. Judge Kathleen, I mean, this is your area when you have individuals that are in front of you. There's emotional abuse. There's,
Sure.
all kinds of things. What are you doing?
And I have to say the opposite. I'm really not aware. I mean, obviously, it's batterers intervention programs that batterers need, much different than anger management. And I'm not aware of a lot of resources for batterers intervention programs that are well run and that have accountability and have been utilized for a period of time. So I would say that that is an area that we need more resources to. We use Accountable Choices in Wayne County, but that's the only program I'm really aware of. And when I talk to people around the state, that's the first question I ask them. What programs do you have for batterers? And I don't think that there's significant resources there. And from my experience, just trying to heal myself, I came across EMDR therapy, which is PTSD, often used for people that have post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very helpful. That's, of course, what
Very
all the children suffer from, and women if they've been abused or have witnessed this abuse in a period of time. And again, it's about resources. Therapy such as that isn't necessarily covered by insurances. And so I think we have a lot to do as a community to help victims in that regard. In the court, yes, we have advocates. Which is why I do like the online system. Is literally they could fill out a PPO online at the Dearborn Police Department. I'm not sure if advocates come into their department or not, but through First Step, they have advocates coming into a lot of the Metro Detroit police stations that will help the victims fill them out right at the police station and then upload them to the court. But a lot of these situations occur late at night or in the early hours of the morning when that's not always possible. Those people aren't online. And we have a very large personal protection order court. We process about 17,000 PPOs a year, which is an astronomical number. It's it's difficult. It's finding resources, helping, as Chief said, people don't come in and report it. And then when we have the PPO even violation hearings, they don't show up for the hearings, and so we can't hold people accountable. And that's the avenue when we have a violation hearing, that we can order that in lieu of jail, you have to go to or participate in this batterer's intervention. But if they don't come to court to advocate or indicate that there's a violation, we don't get that opportunity as a judge to order those things. So there's this always this disconnect.
How is that enforced, though? How is that enforced if they're not present there? I mean, what?
We don't have a complaining witness to proceed with the case. And so it kind of goes to what Chief Ajad was saying, that we need laws in place to say that we're going to proceed forward if there's enough evidence. That works in the criminal setting. It doesn't necessarily work in the civil setting. You need a petitioner to come in and present that evidence.
So, Chief Haddad, in that kind of situation where you do have perpetrators and you have them locked up, so what's the next step? Rather than saying, okay, these are violent criminals, is there any process, working with the courts, working with Access, that you sort of focus on
whether
and
there's
direct
prosecution or not? I mean, to get somebody in front of a judge, hopefully you can get them some help.
Right.
It's not about being locked up or the trip to jail.
Right.
That's not going to fix it.
Right.
And I can say that in our court, the 19th District, we have a veterans court, and if there's alcohol or drug use indicated in these domestic violence cases, we get some cooperation to try to lead them into some, rehab program. So we do have some options there. But there's not enough options. And that's why I really want to push this city ordinance that will allow us to bring cases forward where somebody's really battered, somebody broke into a home, if it's escalating, the third time we've gotten a case with no prosecution, kids involved, take weapons out of the home, and then the victim doesn't want to prosecute. So invariably, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office will deny the warrant, and in no way am I blaming them. I know I worked in Detroit for a few years of my life, and we used to send like 25,000 domestic violence cases to the Wayne County Prosecutor every year back then. So they're a busy place, and they'll call 2 or 3 times, and if the victim doesn't answer up, we get the warrant back denied, failed to prosecute. So, and it's not helping us with the solution. We just put them right back in there, and it tends to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, it's more of the same. So I think that's where the cutoff has to be. Congresswoman Dingell, there's 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 10 men that experience DV within their lifetime. In terms of government, in terms of policy, what can we do as individuals and as even as lawmakers to bring this to the forefront? Because that is a health crisis. It's a pandemic, basically, within our communities. So what are legislators doing? What are the policymakers doing? How are they putting this on the books? And what can we do as citizens and individuals to ensure that this is highlighted and this is a concept that needs to be discussed?
Well,
on a national level.
I think the Violence Against Women's Act really was the act that sought to highlight, among many issues of violence against women.
But there's been pushback on that as well.
Well, and I quite frankly will tell you, I mean, I was the leader of the Violence Against Women Act last year, and the pushback in the Senate against the Dingell bill, which is that there is a loophole in the gun laws that if someone has been convicted, not charged, but convicted of a felony with the use of a gun against a partner, that they should not have access to a gun, that they should be denied. And they have a history already of threatening or harming somebody with a gun. And I believe that when you've had the incident and it's been a conviction of a felony with a gun against a woman or a man, you shouldn't have access to the gun. So they're objecting to the reauthorization as passed by the House because of the Dingell bill. And I'm going to keep pushing because there are people that should not have access to guns. That we know that if there is a gun in a situation that violence is going to occur, something happening is 8 times more likely. And, too many people are dying. So, I mean, I think the fact of the matter is that for all of us, we continue to work, everybody here, to remove the stigma. Because I can remember I sometimes just go to the workshops, I guess they're called, when the women are talking, and I just sit at the back and listen. And mothers are really worried about what it's going to do to their children, or what are they going to. We have to, and what they also, we have to do something to remove stigma. But what we don't understand is that it gets passed from generation to generation.
Right.
And you said, my sister, who's now dead, God bless her soul, had issues, and she married a horrendous guy who she met. I mean, it's a long story, but again, in order for the law enforcement to be able to do something, that person has, well, you're trying to make it so the person doesn't have to press charges. I was tried many times to get her help, but they said to me, she's got to press charges. And I said, you have to press charges. And he had broken every bone in her face. And I got her, you know this story. How many stories do you know? And pressed charges. He was held overnight. He was released the next morning, and she was there picking him up.
Yeah.
You know, and look, I did not talk about this until we were sitting on the floor of the House several years ago on gun control. I'm seasoned, and it was very hard for me to ever talk about it. When I was younger, someone found out about my father and tried to blackmail me in my job before I married John. I mean, we are changing, thankfully. Attitudes are changing, but people really carry the stigma. And no woman, no man, no family has to stay in a situation where their lives are threatened. And I'll never forget what it was like to hide in that closet and be sure that my life was over. And no family should ever have to put up with that, and no parent should make their child go through it.
Very well said. Very well said. You said something about, you know, having to press charges. A lot of women, and it's the Stockholm syndrome. You know, you sort of get connected to your abuser, and that's a psychological issue too that women and men go through. Right. Mona, when a woman comes in to Access and needs help, the fear factor, the psychological abuse, the emotional abuse, the sense of not being safe. And they come to you for help, and yet that person is still out there, and she has the kids. What's the process? How safe can they remain? And is there any? I'm sure you're working with the police department as well to keep the the individuals safe, but there's that fine line. How do we address that?
The challenge is when there's children in the home, you can intervene. If you suspect that the children are getting abused, you can get Child Protective Services involved. Now, if there's not children in the home, it makes it a little bit more challenging because a lot of them that we service every day, a lot of them still live with their abuser. And so it's very hard to understand what it's like to be in an abusive, relationship and feeling trapped. And it's another thing if you don't got support. And then you look at the financial barriers, and there's just so many factors when you're working with individuals or families that you need to consider. And that's why I say we're very person-centered, because every situation is different. And a lot of times they come to us, they're extremely fearful, they're scared. We talk about the police. They don't want to call the police. There's trust issues. There's fear about how the perpetrator is going to respond. They don't want to go to court, or a lot of times I know that you see this, Judge. They're in front of the judge, but they only say half the story.
Right.
So, and that puts them in harm's way in terms of how the case is being handled, because they're so scared to share certain information, rather how it's going to impact them or their families or their children. It's just really, really hard. I lived through an abusive, marriage for 18 years. From day one, I tried to get out. It took me 18 years. And because of how hard it is and the challenges, and especially when there's children. And, I want to circle back to COVID, and what we're experiencing. As it is, it's difficult without COVID. Now, COVID, just put a flame to this, because If they were feeling trapped before, well, now they were really trapped with the lockdowns and the social distancing requirements and everything else that was going on, and with the shelters being full. And there's a reason that a lot of them, I think, that didn't call the police, because they're listening on the news about the correction facilities being full, and then what was going on with COVID within different facilities, and so there was so much fear. And these families were struggling, and we saw a 20% increase in calls and people coming in. We actually had to remove people from their homes, put them in a hotel, get them safe. We were making sure we were delivering food and games and things to the families, working with the families to see a time that works for them. My team did an outstanding job, because, as you mentioned, with technology, not a lot of people know how to use technology. And thank God that you did the online, that whole process with the PPO, because, the first thing I told my attorneys, well, what are we doing? And they're like, okay, no, we're filing online. And it was, okay, this is a sense of relief, because our clients felt safe, because knowing that there's still, it's a different way of doing work, right? But the work is still being done. So again, Siham, there's a lot that goes into us, and this is why I think we need to work harder on prevention. We need to talk to our children and not let them get into this situation to begin with, because once you're in it, it is extremely
Very difficult to get out.
And no one deserves to live in an abusive environment. And that's why at Access we created a program that really, it goes based on whatever their need is, wherever they're at. They choose their level of care. They choose what direction. Do they want to seek legal support? Do they want to go to the police? And today we actually have a partnership with the Dearborn Police Department. Thank you, Chief. We have an advocate housed in the police department, so that when people go there, that they feel safe. And then I want to thank all it's just panelists here. It's such an honor to be with you guys, and I thank you, on behalf of Access, for supporting the work that we do. I mean, it's partnerships like this that helped our community to speak up and to be willing to get help, because they see that, we're working with the courts, we're working with the police departments. We have, our representatives and people who care about us standing with us on these issues. So I think these are the movements that are happening that are critical and that are needed. And this is more about systems change, right? Not just about individual programming, but how do we come together? But COVID has really taught us a lot. Taught us that, we were no longer able to walk through the court doors with our clients. We were no longer able to assist them in the police department. They were no longer able to come into our, agency to get help, and, where maybe they had more freedom in the home to make calls to get, services done. Well, when the abuser's at home, it made it that much more difficult. And, just yesterday, we're talking about children. A client, really not a client yet, but someone in the community, reaches out to me, and she's sharing her story with me, but then sends me a video on WhatsApp about, her and her husband. And just to think that there's 3 children in the home, 7 to 13, and having these children, just having to listen to that. And she had informed me, I'm like, did you call the police? And she did. And she told me, but she didn't share everything with the police because she was scared. But again, that's just another issue that we're having. But, children growing up in these abusive environments has such long-term consequences.
Absolutely. And Mona, I know that you have been definitely a pioneer in this discussion, and you were very integral in creating that lack of shame and to be able to come out and talk about it. Judge, the training that judges go through in regards to making decisions in family court especially, because abusers can present very well.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to see that balance. And then, the other individual is scared to death to really, sort of put it on the table.
Sure.
So what kind of training, what are we looking at in terms of judges to be able to identify those abusers, those narcissists, the abusers, the emotional abusers,
It's a great
physical
question.
abusers?
And, that's what I was going to say about, what we can do in a community. But in our family court, in Wayne County, I require that every sitting family court judge goes through a very intensive training at the National Center for State Court Judges, National Juvenile NCHCG or something.
Something
I
or
don't know the national- but it's a very intense 3 or 4 day training that's unlike any other domestic violence training I've ever had. And it's so intense, and you usually have to go out of state to get it done. But they're looking at. I was just on a call earlier in the month about talking with some people at the state level about bringing that training here to Michigan, because it's a funding issue, of course, with the courts. And but I think minimally our state courts should be required that anyone in the district court, judges, or the family court should be required to take this more intense training. We get a lot of training in domestic violence, but it's not always absorbed. It's very different when you take a 1 hour or a 3 hour training compared to a 3 day intensive training where there's a lot of feedback. And the way the training's done is you're actually put into the victim's shoes, and you go through this training where you move about a room, and you have tickets, and you have a housing ticket, and you have a cell phone ticket, and you lose these things as you're trying to move, and better your situation, so that it really brings home what Mona was saying about, it's one thing to know you need to leave; it's another thing to be able to leave.
The exit plan.
The exit plan. So I think required training, intensive training for our judges is a basic thing, and then I think training too on the lethality factors. It's something that sometimes people talk about, but we're talking about guns in the home. Absolutely, those are huge lethality factors. Whether there's been choking, whether there's been killing of an animal, whether there's substance abuse, these are all part of the lethality factors that indicate to a judge, to a police officer, to a victim's advocate that it's 10 times more likely that there's going to be a victim at the end, somebody's going to die at the end of this domestic violence cycle if we don't remove that person from the home and change something. So just calling attention to those, having training about what that looks like, and those in our court, I think our judges are well trained, and we have checklists that we use for those lethality factors through the PPO courtroom. And when we start seeing some of these on the petitions, these lethality factors, then the director there will do a chart for the judge and say, hey, you've got 5 out of these 10 lethality factors. This is a special case. Not that they're all not serious, but some are certainly more serious than others. So I think those are some of the things we can do.
Absolutely. So are there any like triggers that the judges look for, or is
choking?
it just...
Choking is a big one. Possession of guns, a substance abuse issue. I have the factors in front of me. Let me look. Killing an animal, that kind of thing. We see a lot of choking, and people don't, just like Mona said, when they get in front of the court, it's not only that they don't tell you the most serious parts, they might not even remember, right? I mean, I know as a child I had a lot of memory issues because you suppress that kind of trauma. And so then when they get in front of the court, or they get in front of a situation where they're feeling anxious or scared, that stuff just flies right out of their mind, and they come up with maybe the most recent thing that happened, which was he yelled at me, or something that's a little more innocuous, and not something that's a trigger for a judge to know that you got a serious case in front of you.
Thank you, Judge. Chief, when you go on a run and you see these issues happening, you might get the call. You might get there, and then the woman says, you see that she's battered, you see that there's a situation, and she'll say, no, everything's okay. Everything's okay, because of course by the time you get there she's been intimidated and scared to death. How do you deal with that? Is there a follow-up? What do you do?
State law requires you to make an arrest if there's obvious injury, if there's any property damage, if there's a likelihood that after you leave more violence is going to escalate. So even if she says everything's okay, that's not going to be good enough for us to just go away. We're going to continue to do our full investigation. And I think it's really critical, just sitting here, there's not many options. So we have to do a better job on educating our community, particularly the victims, that unless they get help, unless they get a court-ordered referral, unless they try to help someone who might be addicted to drugs or alcoholism, that it's not going to get any better. So I think from a community educational perspective, we can definitely do a better job there, and we have to do a better job there.
Chief, the only way we're going to get there, though, is if the people in the community, whether it's victims or family of victims, don't feel the system that's supposed to protect them is
Right.
not doing its job. Meaning that, what I often find is that, when you have a survivor going to the police or going to the court, the challenge is they're often having to prove that they were abused, and in feeling interrogated, they're already crippled, and I feel like the system just re-cripples them again. You know what I mean? We're trying to empower them to speak up and to get help. But man, when you're there and that person, you're looking at them, that they're supposed to just look at you and know and feel, because they're done. By the time they've gotten to that point, they're worn down. The manipulative tactics that are used by abusers is just, who are you going against? And it just makes it that much harder. I know for myself. I know when I walked through the court doors, that was the scariest. I was just going for a PPO. That was the scariest thing that I ever had to go through alone. And I went back to Access and I said, we need an attorney. They said, we don't have money for attorneys. I said, no client should ever have to walk through the courtrooms alone. No victim ever. That's the same for the police department. That's why I thank you for, we have an advocate there, and I thank you because of our relationship and partnership that we've been able to, our clients feel safe now going to the police and going into the courts, but we need to do more of that. And, again, there's just so much fear when you're in that situation. And then here, we're looking at the community, how is the community going to look at you? You've already lost your family. Now the community, you're isolated, going back to COVID. Mm-hmm. The number one tactic is isolation. What did COVID do? Further isolated people. So it was an epidemic within a pandemic, a crisis within a crisis, and it just, just a horrible situation. And, I'm glad that we were able all to act quickly and provide remote services and stay connected with people. But there's a lot of people out there that are still scared to make those calls. They don't even have a chance to make those calls. And I heard yesterday this video, I was just stunned, that 3 little kids are having to hear this in the home. Imagine what these 3 kids, and then she shares with me that her 4th child is already on drugs and in the streets, not even at home. So I think that a lot of good is being done, but I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
For sure.
So,
And tragedies are going, unfortunately, are the things that teach us how to move forward and to try to help this particular person. Congresswoman, as a victim of violence.
I'm not a victim.
Okay, being
survivors.
in a survivor.
We all use that word.
Yes,
we
thank you.
We need to not.
Thank you for the
frame it
correction.
that
As
way.
a survivor of domestic
And
violence.
it's funny that even as we talk about it, even at this point, when someone said that to me after I'm like, that it contributes to the stigma. It's just like, no, it's, and I've
Because you feel weak when you hear
yeah,
that.
exactly.
Well, we have some very strong, amazing survivors among us that are doing the work and taking their experiences to help people in a positive direction, and I think that's part of the solution that we're looking for. But as a survivor, what is it that you would say to someone in a position that is fearful for their life, that is in a situation where they really can't get out, where there's control, financial control, emotional abuse, everything that goes with being a victim and prior to being a survivor? What is it that you can give as advice and maybe as resources that you know of that people can attest to?
I think it's what we're all
to
talking
do.
about here today. I mean, even when I listened to the discussion that if they're children, you can intervene. But if the children you're talking about the emotional abuse that they've heard. But if they have not been physically abused, there aren't grounds, if I'm correct, to remove them from the home.
Right.
And I think people don't realize the price the children are paying by living in that situation. And I think many women, men, but mostly women, are feel financially dependent, emotionally dependent, everything in their life, they're afraid to leave because their security is based in this home that's not secure. So access is one of the most important resources we have, but the law enforcement here, our police department is incredibly supportive. Or there's any number, you have to get the courage. Like First Step is another.
First Step, Haven.
I mean,
But
Haven
I think
in
it's
Oakland
that
County.
emotional sense of courage, and you had just mentioned it.
But it's not
how do you
even-
get to that point?
I guess it is courage, but it's that it's just a very emotionally hard decision. But there are women and men that are out there. I've got to quit talking about the women all the time, but when you talk about domestic violence, I think we need to talk about law enforcement more right now, about what it's like to be in a domestic violence situation, and that those calls are the most dangerous. And, the varying degrees of people that are in these situations. But if someone hits you, if you're afraid for your life, if you're afraid for your children's life, you can call the police. They know how to get you to the right resources. If you're afraid to make a scene, you don't want your family. Many people's families, it's a stigma in families. You have to stay. We need to educate all of our families in our community that nobody should have to stay in that situation. But I think that, there's a hotline. We can give you the number of the hotline that people can call in the Dearborn community. I think the two groups that are real Access and then First Step are the two domestic violence programs in this area that can help get you shelter, they can help get you food, they can help get you a lawyer, they can help you while you're in this financial transition, they can give you temporary shelter. So, I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And you have to be emotionally ready to take that step to go
No, you don't
go
have
forward.
to be emotionally ready. I think that's part of the problem. I think sometimes people aren't ever emotionally ready. They're not. I think sometimes people have to be willing to understand, especially if you have children, what you're leaving your children in. And you're not emotionally ready. You can love somebody that's beating you, but you need to understand that being beaten or that being hit or the emotional abuse that you are taking is not healthy. It's destroying you. And even though you're not ready, that for the sake of yourself or for your children, you need to reach out to have somebody help you make that step.
That's the advice
And
I
I
was
think
looking
if
for.
we start educating people more about, when they are seeking out for help, a lot of them are like, oh my God, if I, go to Access and go to this problem, I have to make a decision right there and then.
Right.
People understand that, these decisions take time, and there's advocates willing to work with them so that they can figure it out while they put a safety plan together. Planning is a big process, for this, type of situation. It takes time to think it through, but you have to have your support system.
Absolutely.
And once you have those things lined up, you are more able to get the help that you need to get yourself to a better place.
And you need an exit plan, basically.
oh,
You need an exit plan.
that takes-
This is when I'm going to do
absolutely.
this. This is the next step. I'm going to
But
make sure I have shelter.
you should have an exit plan and work on the safety plan, but if you're in immediate danger, you don't need to have an exit plan.
Yeah.
You need to call for help.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, part of the planning is from beginning to end. But obviously, if you're in a dangerous situation, you should call 911 right away.
Correct.
And again, we talk about this, the planning piece, and I want to circle back to Access because, this is a program that makes me very proud to represent because, a lot of times when someone's in an abusive relationship, go get counseling. You need help. Rather than, telling the person that, no, you get the services that you need because, they've been told that they're crazy, and now we're telling them, you need counseling. So, that doesn't set right with these survivors. So kind of what we do is we let them decide what services that they need. We offer all of them. And at some point, a lot of them will utilize most of the services. But at the beginning, they might come in just for legal advocacy. And that's fine. They might come in just for financial support, and that's fine. Might be housing, whatever that may be.
Is there a number, Mona, that you
Absolutely. Actually, we have an Access Domestic Violence 24-hour crisis hotline, which is 838-782-6333. 348.
And we'll put that up on the screen as
We
well.
also have our Access Domestic Violence Screening program. The phone number is 313-348-4493.
Thank you. We only have just a couple more minutes. Judge, I want you to have the last word in regards to emotional abuse, because that's not bruises. That's what is the court's focus on that, and how is that dealt with, if at all? At this point?
Right. I mean, that's kind of the hidden, silent danger in all of this, and I think that's what Congressman Dingell was alluding to. Is that's the result for these children that are in this home, and they might not be bruised and battered, but they need therapy. They need therapy. They need serious therapy, not light therapy, not little therapy. You know, things that for PTSD and things that get to the root of the things that they've seen and that they've heard, and that they become a protector of their parents at a young age. Things that, you know, they live lives as little children, you know, far beyond their years, which is horrifying. It's horrifying.
Well, definitely the conversation has to continue. We'll put the resources up on the screen, the numbers that Mona gave us for access, and some other hotlines. And I also know that when you go to healthcare professionals, sometimes they have a pen that's red and a pen that's blue. And if you are a victim of domestic violence and you use the red pen, they know that you're in trouble, and they'll try to talk to you as well. And a lot of restaurants have receipts right at the bottom with the hotline number. So there's different resources that people out there are finally realizing this is an issue we have to deal with. I want to thank all our distinguished panelists and appreciate the time that you took with us today to speak about this vital component in our social structure. Mona Mackey, thank you for everything you do. You definitely are a pioneer in this discussion. Chief Haddad, thank you for being on the front lines and keeping the peace always. Judge McCarthy, what can I say? You've transformed the courts basically single-handedly and have really focused on families and safe families. So thank you for all you do. And Congresswoman Dingell, you are just a dynamo. You're an icon, and thank you for everything that you do as well. I hope that we can come together as a society and ensure that we address these issues openly and honestly. In doing so, we can certainly address the crisis head-on. We pray that our nation will heal, justice will continue to be served, and that we as a nation and a human race will embrace the struggle collectively with passion, compassion, and a fire in our bellies to ensure equality, social justice, and eradicate the concept of domestic and racial violence with a unified voice. On behalf of myself, Access, WDHT-Tv, WCDRC, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being part of the solution. A special shout out to Jacob and Angela for our tech expertise, so thank you, and to Gus Hassan and the management of the Atrium in Dearborn for allowing us to utilize this beautiful facility for the broadcast today. So thank you all. Have a beautiful day, and please stay safe, and God bless.